Welcome to the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, where we have open and honest conversations about co-parenting, separation, divorce, and the hardest question of all, should you stay or should you go? I'm Kate Anthony, your divorce survival guide, and I'm here to help you navigate some of the roughest waters you've ever swum in and answer some of your toughest questions. I've been to hell and back. And now it's my mission in life to help you get to the other side of this process with your sanity and your heart intact.
Hey everyone, welcome back. So, we have kind of a lot to cover today. I don't want to say too much right now because I want to honor my guest today, Heather Plett, who I have known on the interwebs for a long time. And we just so wonderfully connected. I was on her podcast. I had her on mine, obviously. That's what we're doing today. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful conversation that I really want to get to it. But obviously, there is some stuff in the space here about the fact that I chose to close my Facebook group recently. And for those of you who missed it, I'm sorry if this is the first you're hearing of it and if it's shocking and jarring, but I might do a little mini episode that will drop at the beginning of next week. Actually, I'm going to do a little mini episode on this that'll drop at the beginning of next week, maybe Monday or Tuesday, with a little more in-depth information and explanation about how everything came to pass. But at the end of the day, it was a boundary issue for me. And I had very clear rules about being in the space that people agreed to before they even entered the group. And they weren't being honored. And that makes sense. There were over 18,000 women in the group. And there were some tough rules that were different than other groups. But the fact remains that it's a group of over 18,000 women. And it's hard to manage that many people if it's not your full-time job, really, ultimately. And it can't be my full-time job because I have other aspects of my business that I'm running. So anyway, like I said, I will get into it in another episode. I wanted to acknowledge it. I wanted to just at least say something about it here today and let you know that I'll say more coming up soon. But now I want to turn our attention to the art of holding space with Heather Plett. Heather is the author of the award-winning book, The Art of Holding Space, a practice of love, liberation, and leadership. And she is the author of the recently released book, Where Tenderness Lives, on healing, liberation, and holding space for oneself. One of the things that Heather talks about in her book is her divorce and how holding space for herself, honoring herself and embracing tenderness towards herself was a huge part of having the strength to leave her marriage. So really relevant to all of you guys. And I'm really, really honored and excited to bring you this conversation with my friend, Heather Plett. Heather, thank you so much for coming on and talking about all the things tenderness and holding space.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you again.
I know, me too. I was on your podcast recently, and it was just such a great conversation. I will link to that in the show notes too. So, I want to start off with, we're going to get to your divorce and all of those things. Mm-hmm. But you run something called the Center for Holding Space.
That's right.
And you've written a book about holding space, the art of holding space, right? And I want to know, in your words, what that means. What does it mean to hold space? I know you lecture on this, you speak about this, you speak about this. I know it's a giant subject.
Yeah.
And if you could just let us
Give you the Coles notes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I have to admit that, so I've been working with this concept for over 10 years now, and it is an evolving concept. Like, I think I define it differently than I once did. Like the basic definition that I give in the book, that it's a practice of walking alongside someone who's going through something significant in their life, and you're walking alongside them without judging them or trying to direct the process or layering on your unsolicited advice. And you do that with compassion and tenderness and a willingness to withhold your own biases and et cetera from the process. That's where I started with the concept. But to be honest, it just keeps getting deeper and richer, and more I recognize that although I first defined it as an external practice where you're holding space for someone else, it's even more important to know how to hold space for yourself so that you can show up in a relationship that is less codependent, and you are not attaching yourself to their stuff and wanting to fix their stuff for them. So it's really, and that's where my second book comes in, Where Tenderness Lives. It's that learning to be with yourself well so that you can be with another person.
One of the things I love is that, being Facebook friends with you for as long as I have been, it feels like forever. I love how open and honest you are about how hard that can be, even for you, the person who writes the books about it, right? That
the quote unquote expert.
Right, exactly, right?
Yeah.
We're always I guess learning from our own, I don't want to say failures, but missteps or right. And that it's really how hard it is for us to be tender with ourselves and hold space for ourselves, especially in our more vulnerable or, more difficult moments.
It's probably true, and you might be able to attest to this too, that we teach the thing we most need to learn ourselves. That, and I didn't really set out to create this whole body of work around holding space, but it tapped me on the shoulder and said, "This is your work, now do it." And so that's meant a really deep dive into this practice. And the only way that I know how to do a deep dive that is teachable and transferable is to do it for myself first. And so very early on, in fact, it was so the holding space work really blew up when I had a viral blog post back in 2015 that went kind of nutty viral, like 10 million people in the first year or something. And it just continues to spread around the world as well. And it actually kind of brought me to the brink of burnout because it crashed my website and got really, really intense. And like 4 months later, I was ending my marriage because I realized that I had to be in a place of integrity to teach this work. And I couldn't be in integrity teaching what it means to hold space if I was in a marriage that did not know how to hold space. Like, honestly, he didn't know how to hold space for me, and I didn't know how to hold space for him. So there was this real dissonance in my life from what I was teaching in the world and what I was living in my own home. And that's what blew up my life, really. I mean, I was on the verge of getting there anyways, but developing this work that is so much about being in integrity with myself caused me to see what I needed to do to change.
That's so interesting, right? Because it's one of those things where when the world starts to perceive you as something, and it's so disconnected from the way you view yourself or you feel that you're viewed in your marriage, right? Is that sort of what it's like you were stepping into something really huge for yourself. And I can imagine that, like, the image that I have is that, like, the marriage was this thing that was sort of like holding you down and back.
Yeah, very much so, because I would go do these really beautiful workshops and retreats around holding space and talking to people how to do this. And then I would go back into my own home and kind of shut down and guard myself against what was going on in my own home. And and it was two ways. I'm not saying it was just that he didn't know how to hold space for me, but I was guarded against really resisting holding space for him as well. And it just felt like there's no way that I can truly live into this sense of mission and calling I have with this work if I'm in a relationship that doesn't align with it. And so it's a matter of making a choice which way to go. Either stay in the marriage and just keep working on something that's not living up to what I know this work can be, or lean into the work. And I chose to lean into the work because I knew that it would, I knew it was going to blow up my life, and it has, but B, I knew that that was the way to live well with myself and in integrity and in authenticity with myself.
I think that's like, there's something so sort of beautiful and tragic at the same time, right? But there's something really beautiful about being willing to hear that calling, right? It's like when you have a calling that's that loud, you know, the courage that it takes to and holding space for that in yourself, right? But the courage that it takes to walk through that and allow the calling to guide you, even if it's away from all of the things that you've known and have found, you know, some semblance of comfort in, it's so courageous and terrifying, I can imagine.
It is, and it also saved my life. I mean, I think that's the thing about when you really do lean into the things that are scary and take a lot of courage and take really risking everything. They're the things that make your life actually worth living and make you come alive and give you a sense of purpose and all of those things. And so I have absolutely no regrets. Like, I can't imagine, I suspect my body would have continued to shut down in a really significant way if I'd stayed in a marriage that was not feeding me and not nurturing me. And so it's absolutely worth the risk. So I would say to anybody that's listening to this, like, if you're on that precipice of doing something really significant, blowing up your life, if that's the only way that you can live in integrity with yourself, then there is no other choice. Like, you absolutely just have to lean into it to live in a healthy way with yourself and to find joy in your life. And that's so, no, I don't, I have no regrets.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that it makes it easy because there's a lot of collateral damage. I have 3 daughters who had to go through their own stuff when I got divorced, and a lot of people in my life that were impacted by it. So there is collateral damage, but it's still worthwhile.
Absolutely. And I want to just, in your book, you do talk about, I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but you do talk in your book about your husband's mental health issues,
right,
and how that was really something that had kept you in your marriage for so long. And I feel like that's a conversation that a lot of women could really use, would be very useful for them to hear, because I think that, there's the codependency and there's the natural caretaking in all of us. And then there's the, I'm responsible for keeping this person alive.
Right. Exactly.
Part of us. So I'm wondering if you would tell a little bit of that. What that was like for you.
I will. And I'll say, first of all, that this is some of the most tricky thing to talk about, and it's some of the most important things to talk about, because I've heard from so many women that this helped them release themselves from a similar kind of situation. So my former husband suffered some fairly serious mental health issues. Twice in our marriage, he attempted suicide. So when it came to ending the marriage, there was always a fear that the ending of our marriage could cause him to attempt suicide again and perhaps be successful this time. And I knew that would have a huge impact on my daughters. And so it took me years and years to get to that position where I was no longer taking responsibility for his mental health, because we had established such a deep pattern in the 22 years of our marriage of me being hyper vigilant to his emotional well-being and caretaking. And I mean, not always willingly. I was resentful of him and I wasn't always kind to him. And I won't say that I was like the perfect caregiver by any stretch.
Of course not.
But I had a hypervigilance in my body for when his emotions would start to turn and go to the dark side, and when I would need to rescue him from that. And so that was the position our marriage was always in. And I didn't recognize just how much that was true until I was out of it and started to actually release some of that hypervigilance that was in my body, and only came to the language of codependency like a few years after the marriage was over. That's how long some of this stuff takes.
Sure.
But yeah, when you subconsciously develop so much responsibility for somebody else's mental health, it begins to control your life, and you make all your decisions based on what can I do to not trigger him, to make his life balanced enough so that this won't happen again.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to point out that your husband's mental health struggles were very legitimate. They were real. They were not manipulation tactics.
No.
They were like, this is real for him and in your marriage. And so, when someone actually attempts suicide twice, like you're dealing with this, like the fear is real.
Yeah, exactly. It is very real fear. And I so did not want to blame him or shame him.
No.
And that's part of the reason it's so hard to write about this, because I don't want to put a negative light on the mental health issues that he was dealing with. And I didn't want to make it uncomfortable even for him. Like, he's a good person. I don't want to paint him as an evil villain or in any way. I just want to be able to tell my side of the story about the impact that it had on me. Right. And so that's the really hard stuff about being in relationship with someone with a serious mental health challenges is it's hard to tell the truth without vilifying them or making them look like a bad person. And yeah, it's all real. And there are many, many people that are dealing with this every single day and make different choices than I do. And that's entirely their choice. I don't negate anybody else's choice in this situation, but it's a hard thing to free yourself from and decide to make a different choice.
And I appreciate also that you said like it was a process, right? It was before the marriage ended, you had already spent a number of years setting new boundaries. And so it wasn't like you dropped him off a cliff.
No, absolutely not. I mean, there were 5 good years of really trying hard to make this work. Like 5 years before the marriage ended, I gave him, I guess, kind of an ultimatum and said, you need to take the initiative to find us counseling, and then I will submit to it. But otherwise, the marriage is over. And he did. And to his credit, he did work on it quite hard for a while to try to work on his own issues so that we could make the marriage work. But it just kept reverting back to old patterns again and again. We went through kind of 3 cycles of marriage counseling, and then he did personal counseling in that. So it was a lot of effort to make it work. I didn't want to just walk away. I wanted to, commit to it and do my best to try. But in the end, I knew that to save myself, I had to walk away.
We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I want to dive into another story from your book. Okay, we are back. So in your book, you tell this amazing story it's so evocative the way that you tell it, about the woman behind the door.
Right.
It's such a beautifully powerful story. And I wonder if you can tell it to us.
I will. And there's actually an interesting update to that story since the book was published. Yeah. So in Minneapolis at the Weizmann Art Museum, I think I might be getting that name wrong, but there's an art exhibit where the outside of it's like against the wall, there's a doorway, and it's with a sign over the top that says Petticord Apartments. You walk through the doorway and it's like you're walking into a 50-year-old, maybe older apartment building, and you walk down the hallway and there are all these doors on either side of the the hallway, and the hallway's getting narrower and smaller as you walk towards the end. So it has this kind of claustrophobic feel as you walk down it. And each doorway, you can lean in and listen to what's happening on the other side of the door. And on one door, there's a family arguing, and another door, they're watching sports on TV. And in the very end, the last door, there's a woman crying, just weeping unconsolably, weeping and weeping. And the first time I went there, I had just asked my former husband for a separation. And I just couldn't walk away. Like, I just felt like I have to sit with this woman weeping on the other. And of course, you can't see her. It's just a soundtrack on the other side, and you only hear it when you lean in. But I just felt so connected to this woman weeping on the other side of the door. And then I went back a few years later and had to go back. I was in Minneapolis again, and I had to go back again. And I sat for a long time. I even brought my journal that time and was sitting on the other side of the door. And so in the chapter of the book where I talk about the ending of my marriage, I use that kind of as the framing, this woman who's behind the door, just unconsolably weeping and weeping. And it so related to my story throughout the years of my marriage, how I would so often be behind closed doors by myself, just crying, because I didn't know how to talk about what was going on in my marriage. I didn't know who to talk to, because I didn't want to be disloyal to my former husband. So nobody around us really knew what was going on. I hadn't found the meaningful support that I needed. And so this woman became one of my kind of companions as I went through this process of ending the marriage. The update to the story is that just a few weeks ago, I was in Minneapolis again. I did a book tour and recently, and I had a book event in Minneapolis. And so I went back to the museum and went to visit her, and I leaned in again. And this time, what I hadn't noticed before is that her weeping was actually, that kind of crying that's on the verge between laughter and tears, where you've either cried so hard that you sort of burst into laughter, or you've laughed so hard that you burst into tears. Like, you're at that real edge of deep grief and just kind of hysteria.
Yeah.
And I heard that in her crying, and I thought, oh, wow, like she's at a transition point. Like, she's going to survive this because she's gone to the depths of the grief, and she's leaning into the place of you might as well laugh, or there's something about this that felt transitional that I hadn't felt before. And it was something about it that just left me feeling like this woman's going to survive. Like, she's got the resources and skills to get through this, and she's going to survive. And so I just left feeling, and I mean, again, it was related to my own story, because now I'm nearly 8 years post-divorce, and I can relate so differently to that woman that I was then, weeping behind the door, and knowing the joy I've found in my life since, and that transition did happen. And so hoping that for her. I mean, there was obviously projection going on, but that's what felt really meaningful to me this time.
I mean, yes, there is projection going on, but I would hazard to guess that that's part of the purpose of the art, right?
Sure,
is that,
absolutely.
we bring our own experiences, and we have our own experiences of the art based on where we are. And what a great marker of your growth,
right?
that you could hear laughter for the first that you had never heard before, having been there a few times before. That's so cool. I love that.
Yeah. And I didn't feel so much like I needed to rescue her. Like, and maybe that's a mark of my movement out of codependency too, to sit alongside this woman. Because the first times I was like, I got to break through that door, and I've got to help her. I've got to fix her. And now it's like, oh, I can sit on the other side, trusting that she has the resources to pick herself up off the floor and go on. But, she still needs companionship, but she doesn't need anyone breaking through the door to fix her.
Oh, so beautiful. It's so beautiful. I just want everyone to kind of hear that, right? It's going to be okay. It will be okay.
Exactly.
I have conversations with women like you who are on the other side of this, because I want people to know, who are still in the midst of it or trying to decide, that like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And that like laughter crying, because that's just so cool that, at a certain point, we're going to get to the point where we can laugh at it, sometimes through tears,
Yeah.
but like,
yeah. And you have that
going.
breakthrough. And that's some of the work that I teach in my holding space work is just being present for all of the emotional experiences you're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to go to the depths. You're going to go to that fear place. You're going to, like I say, having the complexity of my marriage where I was feeling so responsible for the mental health of my former husband. It took me years to release that. And the first few years, I was really easily triggered and worried and, would go into anxiety over it. And now when I think back, it's like, wow, I survived that. Like there were such intense moments. And now it's like it's a whole different story. And so recognizing those transition points, recognizing that we have the capacity to live through really hard times and to hold ourselves in that grief and fear. And we don't crumble. We're, we're more solid than we think we are.
Right. And he's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And I have to trust that he is. And if he's not, that's not my burden anymore. Right. And that's the complexity of releasing yourself from someone who for whom you took too much responsibility for, is like his path is his path and he can walk it without me in his life. And his choices are his responsibility. And it's not the end of the world if he makes a choice that I don't agree with or that doesn't feel healthy. That's his choice. That's his path. And so, yeah, that's a really tough thing. And I think there's far more codependency built into our relationships, built into our culture, a patriarchal culture, many of us as women. That's embedded in our social conditioning as women to become codependent, to take too much responsibility. And so unlearning those patterns is some of the most important work that I think we can do.
Yes. Oh, so much so. So I want to talk about tenderness. Mm-hmm. But I want to, you also talk about how tenderness is a disruption.
Right.
All that
Absolutely.
Patriarchal, capitalist, infrastructure. Yeah. How is tenderness? How do you see that as being disruption, right? Because we could see that as codependency, that we're being tender towards others, but we're talking, right, self.
I'm talking primarily starting with tenderness for yourself. Mm-hmm. And the way that this came up for me, I started to recognize in myself far too much self-criticism, far too much measuring of my own worth, measuring of my body's worth, measuring of like my capacity or my productivity. And I sometimes talk about the hard P's of the patriarchy. I talk about like performance, like punishment, productivity, perfectionism, all of those kinds of values based in a capitalist patriarchal system that result in us learning to evaluate ourselves and punish ourselves and be really hard on ourselves and self-critical. And so I started to recognize those patterns in myself and all of the people I work with, people that come to me as clients or learners in our programs. And I thought, there has to be another way. Like, this is not working for us. And so I one day, actually, it just sort of popped into my head, this idea of tenderness. It was actually on the anniversary of my mom's death. I was sitting there with my journal, and it was like tenderness showed up and sat on the couch next to me and kind of said, like, why are you treating yourself this way? That, this is not the right way. And so I started to explore how does that disrupt those patterns? If I'm genuinely tender with myself, if I'm tender with my body, even when it's not doing what I expect it to do, even I'm a living in a fat body. So I'm, self-critical of weight and all those things and abilities and physical health. But if I start to be tender with myself in all those ways, I'm disrupting the patterns, I'm disrupting the expectations, the pressure that we put on ourselves from a cultural perspective. And I'm starting with a really gentle, like self-talk around, you know what? You're doing your best. You're trying hard. You've got a good, your body is a good body. You're like, and so it's a reversing of the language that we've adopted from living in these oppressive systems. And I've really been inspired by Sonia Renee Taylor's book, The Body is Not an Apology. This helped crack some of this open for myself, because she really talks about radical self-love is the most disruptive tool for overturning the patriarchal systems and the oppressive systems. And so so for me, tenderness, self-tenderness, when I am tender with myself, it allows me I don't see tenderness as meekness in any way. Like, tenderness has to be well boundaried. It's saying I reserve the right to be really, really kind to myself and not to accept treatment that is not kind to me and to this body. And so that means I stand up to people in the healthcare system who don't respect certain kinds of bodies, or people who are like hard on women or hard on, and then so I start with myself, and then I can turn that to other people that as well. I can offer them tenderness from that place of deep self-love. And so then when I hold space for someone else, it's not a codependent thing. It's look, I'm going to treat myself this way. I expect you to treat yourself that way. And then we can do that for each other without becoming entangled or enmeshed in that relationship.
Yes, I love that. And it's such a cliche, right? It has to start with the self. It's got to start with the self, but it is so true. I mean, it can't not, because if it doesn't, then we're moving into codependency. Then
absolutely,
we're telling other people to do shit that we're not willing to do for ourselves. Like, how does that work, right? Then it's hypocrisy, all of the things. Yeah.
Well, and that's when I first started this work, when I realized that in order to learn how to hold space, I had to get out of the relationship where space wasn't being held. Mm-hmm. So it was doing a really, what felt like a cruel thing in order to be more, to do deeper work in holding space, to be able to show up with more compassion for other people. Because when you're in unhealthy codependent relationships, it's going to suck you dry of all the capacity for tenderness with other people. It's like it's taking all of your good resources into an unhealthy relationship. Whereas if you start putting up boundaries against those kinds of relationships, you start protecting yourself, you start evolving, saying, no, that is not acceptable. I'm going to be in relationships where there is mutual respect, where we have mutual sovereignty and we have consent in the relationship. Then I can lean into actually having a tender, respectful relationship with people. So it's a transformation of how we are in relationship with each other.
It really, really is. We're going to take one more break, and then I want to come back and talk about like what that looks like as a practice in your life. Okay, so we were just talking about tenderness and holding space, and I'm curious to know what that looks like in the day-to-day, like in the practical, right? Like, how do we sit down as a practice and be tender?
Well, it starts with kind of evaluating your choices based on what is the most tender way for me to treat myself. And so it's a daily thing. It's waking up in the morning and asking yourself, what's the most tender way that I can be with myself this day, right now? Do I postpone the meeting that's supposed to start really early because I'm not a morning person. I don't function well in the morning. So I'm going to choose to be tender with myself by asking that person meet with me at 2 this afternoon. Do we start with that? Or do I start by going outside for a walk? And I'm a big believer in having a nature-based practice by spending as much time as possible out with the trees. Or I moved to an island recently where I get to live close to a lake and walk in the forest as much as possible. So it's making choices rooted in your own capacity for tenderness. And so it's like choosing which relationships you'll be in, choosing who you're going to give time to, because based on how healthy you can be in that relationship. It's daily practices. I teach a variety of tenderness practices, everything from journal practices, how to sit with yourself and have a conversation. Sometimes it's a back and forth. I'll have tenderness speaking to me and then I'll respond and we have this conversation in my journal. It's body practices. How can you be tender? Maybe you want to buy a new scented lotion and develop some kind of tenderness practice around how you can be really nurturing to your own body. Or I'm a big believer in hot baths, long hot baths, and reading a book in the bathtub. Like I say, it's embodiment practices, it's journal practices, it's nature-based practices, it's relational practices, being in community, finding people who are in support of your own tenderness, people that will come alongside you in that way. So it's really a transforming your life to some degree. And that's what my second book is about, is kind of my deepening into my own tenderness by unraveling the pieces of my life that were not particularly tender, and removing myself from some relationships so that I could find more of that in my life.
It sounds like there's like a starting point of like an inventory, right?
Right.
Of sort of bringing conscious awareness to the places in your life where you feel are not tender or particularly loving to yourself, right?
Yeah. So for the book, the prologue and epilogue of Where Tenderness Lives, I share this little allegorical story called the girl in the Velcro dress.
Yes.
And it's about this girl who comes to this realization that in her childhood she was taught how to sew a Velcro dress, and she was taught by her mothers and her female lineage before her. And she sewed this dress because that's the only choice which she was really given at that time. And it's Velcro so that people who come in contact with her can attach their things to her dress. So there's a sense of projection and codependency and all that, because people are forever attaching things onto her dress that don't necessarily belong to her. And it becomes so heavy, she can barely bear it because she's carrying around the weight of other people's expectations and all of that for so long. And one day she just gets so exhausted from it that she sinks down under it and discovers this little cave where she can begin to nourish herself and find some tenderness for herself. And so when I teach tenderness, I will often start with this girl in the Velcro dress, or we'll expand it to this person in Velcro clothing so that it's non-gendered. We'll begin to unravel. So what are the things that have been attached to your dress? What are you carrying around as an expectation, as a bias, perhaps, as a burden of responsibility, as a codependency? And how can you begin to unravel each of those pieces? And there's always an emotional moment when I'll do this exercise with people where they create their own Velcro clothing and they write on little pieces of either Velcro or sticky notes or something, the things that people have attached to them. And when they start to unravel and realize, I don't have to carry that anymore, you can see it in their bodies, that beginning of opening up to some other possibility. And there's often tears are shed at that moment. And so, yeah, it's an unraveling of that, and first witnessing it. And this can take a long, long time to begin to witness the ways you've been unkind to yourself because it was cultural, because it was a family pattern, whatever it was that you're carrying, and whatever those reasons were for carrying it.
I think it's important to say, too, that when you're releasing yourself of all of those pieces, there's the cultural expectations, there's the patriarchal expectations, all of these sort of like somewhat, they're not unspoken, but many of them are, unspoken, or they're these expectations, right? But then there's also the people involved, right? And like your husband's mental illness, that was attached to you. And that sometimes shedding those pieces, while it's really tender and important for you, can be very disruptive to others. And then, so how do you, when you're teaching this, how do you work with people to hold that balance and, be okay with it or not okay with it?
There's no one size fits all with this work. Everybody has to make their own choices. And I can't know what burdens you're carrying and why. And some people, and I wrote chapters about my parents, for example, in there, and some of the things I carried on behalf of my parents. And that was hard even now to write, that my parents have both died. And I had a really hard time being really honest about that, because I love my parents. I don't want to say anything ill about them. I don't want to, I don't want to blame or shame them for layering things onto my dress, because I also wrote in that chapter how I came to a real realization of the things I was layering onto my kids' dresses too. And so I had to come to terms with, look, this isn't just, my stuff. It's what I'm passing on. I have to take responsibility for that as well. And so we are in relationships, we are in community, we are in families. That continues to be true. And we have to navigate those with care and compassion. And I am by no means suggesting that, you throw away every relationship because people are putting things on your dress. That's not the case, because we're all always putting things on each other's clothing without knowing it. And so we learn to do this dance of inviting other people to take some responsibility. And if they're not willing to take some responsibility, then maybe we need to put a boundary up to protect ourselves. But what's the way that we can live with that? And I've gone through, for example, with my daughters, that we've had some really intentional conversations around this when they wanted to reveal to me that I had layered things on their, Velcro clothing. And I had to go through some really heavy stuff to take responsibility for it myself. And that's not easy. And so you might be, when you start to address these things, it's really going to be confronting for people. And so navigating that in the best way you know how. And I, like I say, there's not one answer for this. Finding somebody who can walk alongside you, whether that's a coach or therapist or a group of people that can support you. But in the end, doing things that feel like they are the most honest for you, the most authentic for you, the most life-giving for you, the way that helps you thrive in your life, and again, disentangling yourself from other people's emotional response. Because yes, somebody's going to have a big response to me asking them to take responsibility for that. I want to be compassionate with them, and I don't want to forever be taking that burden of their emotions on again and again, which has been my pattern, as I said, in my marriage. And so it's learning to, and not only invite them to take responsibility, but then unraveling from their reaction to the responsibility.
Yes, that's right. There's this whole, such a notion, this patriarchal messaging, that it's like our responsibility and it is our duty to take care of and to, be everybody's mother. And that a lot of the messaging is that detaching from that is selfish.
Right.
And I think that it's, while untangling from all of, like, you're taking the pieces off of your clothing that belong to other people, but it's also the messaging that to do so is selfish, is toxic, is, whatever it is. Removing that layer as well it's really complicated for women.
It is. And let me tell you, 8 years after ending my marriage, there were still moments when, I'll wake up in the middle of the night and feel guilty over something I did, or making a selfish choice, or there are, and I've really adopted some of the language of internal family systems, recognizing there's a part of me that, it's not all of me, but there's a part of me that's feeling guilty or feeling some shame about that, or worrying that I might have been selfish. And so learning to soothe those parts of me that are succumbing to some of that external messaging, because yes, there are certainly people that blamed me for ending a marriage that they didn't have any reason to think was unhealthy. So it'd be externally, they didn't see what was going on. And so you have to face that and face the expectations of other people. And at the end of the day, the only person you're really going to live with fully is yourself. The only person whose internal experience you're going to have is your own. And so to live with yourself in integrity is the most important relationship. And so those choices still, even though they're hard and they may hurt people, still have to be made on your own behalf.
I love it. I love it. Heather, thank you so much. I love talking to you. I feel like you're just like a bomb. You really are.
That's so sweet.
And where can people find you and do this work with you and have all of these amazing experiences with you?
So my business partner and I run a business called Center for Holding Space, and we are Canadian. So we use the Canadian spelling of center with an RE at the end, but we actually own the URL for the American version. So if you misspell it, you'll still land at us. So centerforholdingspace.com is our primary space where we offer lots of courses. We're accepting registration for our 8-month Learning to Hold Space, How to Hold Space Foundation program. It's a modular program, and that's kind of the core of our work. We also do a certification program in that. And then we have a number of other courses and some self-study programs there. So there's lots of resources at centerforholdingspace.com. We've just launched a Substack called A Tender Space, and that's where our podcast is housed, which you have been a guest on. So atenderspace.substack.com is another place to find us and to sign up for our newsletter and podcast. And then I also have a personal site, heatherplett.com, where I still house some of my own writing and separate from the business. So there's multiple places to find me.
I highly recommend that everyone go and find Heather in all of the places.
Thank you.
I just adore you, and I love the work that you're doing, Heather. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Divorce Survival Guide podcast. If you like what you hear, head on over to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen in and leave me a review. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram at The Divorce Survival Guide. I'll see you next time, and until then, remember, you, my love, deserve to be happy.